Ladies and gentlemen, would you please kindly take a seat so that we may start? Welcome back. We saw most of you yesterday. Those who attended yesterday know that the work we have in mind is a packed schedule. So, since we have a lot in our plate, I would really love to start punctually. So, as you have seen in our program that you can browse on the internet or from the badge, there's going to be a first part, the plenary session, with our wonderful speakers who will hold their keynote speeches, then a coffee break, and the teamwork tables. Some will attend them here at the Cursal. Some will go to the Museo Civico, not the Santa Scholastica Museum, as initially indicated. But no worries, we will have someone guiding you to the right place. After lunch, we will have the feedback from the discussions that have taken place at the comparison tables. So Martina De Luca will introduce our day's work. Thank you to our president who has highlighted all the most important housekeeping pieces of information. It's going to be a packed day, wonderfully organized. We will continue our discussions on the Mediterranean collections and heritage. Yesterday, we've listened to the presentations of two speakers who explained how the Mediterranean collections can be better narrated. And today we're going to continue on this red line, and we will hear from three very renowned and important speakers who continue their narration on the Mediterranean, the ancient Mediterranean, heritage narratives and cross-border dimensions, and museum networks. So three different points of view to focus on museum collections, and these will be very, very useful to understand how to tackle all of our topics. So I would like to ask Mrs. Frisone, who has delved into the ancient Mediterranean peoples, how the contacts of histories and laboratory of histories has become very, very important and still continue to be resonant and relevant for us. Thank you very much, Martina, for this wonderful presentation. And I will take the floor. To start, I would really love to thank everybody. Initially, of course, to Antonella Pinna, the president of ICOM Italy. It's a great honor and privilege to speak about the Mediterranean here in this wonderful convention with all of you in front of me. Then I'd also like to thank my guides, those who have accompanied me to this moment, Mrs. Maresca, Barbara Landa, Valeria Marbito, and under the protective wing of Lucia Ferruzza. I am notoriously, if I may say so, person who is known for not respecting times. So I'm going to read so as to respect the allotted times. I'm not going to have a spontaneous presentation, but I'm going to read. And in order to start, I have a question, not a rhetorical one by the one. It should be, the driving force of what I'd like to speak about this morning and convey to you all. Is in as Lawrence wrote in his novel Balthazar, the Mediterranean is an absurdly small sea, and it is the length and grandeur of its history that make us dream of it being larger than it is. I believe it is precisely the narration of this history that can constitute today a communicative challenge for museums, and that's where I'd like to start from. So the question is, which Mediterranean do we narrate, recount about? Antiquity, the distant time of history, is certainly a dimension shared by all communities living on the shores of the Mediterranean. I think of those beautiful pages written by Brodel, speaking of a sea that represented scenarios of the past, and in a spark of daily light was able to give new light to landscapes populated by memory and memories, through which a shared past is given back to us. Now, this idea that has been criticized by modern historians and scholars, that has been considered as a colonialist and European-centric vision, well, I believe that we have no longer this juxtaposition, and we may find a Brodelian response to the definition of the point of observation that since the pioneer stories of the French historian, our father, is presented over and over again. What is the Mediterranean? How do we narrate about it? Antique story is, in fact, the minimum denominator. It can be told in different ways, and it's a shared horizon, a reality where we can meet the prerequisite of our convention these 2 days. So when we decide to speak and recount about that antiquity, we have to consider it as our heritage, our collections, our holdings that are told by our Mediterranean museums. What Mediterranean are we recounting? What are we telling and what are we not telling? Because there is not just one idea of Mediterranean, and we are very well aware of it for its multifaceted and plural origins and realities of these territories and regions, perspectives, histories. The sea between the lands is always presented with its physiognomy, which has different proteform shapes. By the way, there is an aspect that really demarcates borders, frontiers, boundaries, a sea that separates us from one or more them, north and south, prosperity and poverty, order and chaos. Is it the Mediterranean of anxieties of the present times, of fear, where there is an invasion perceived to the fortress, which is Europe, the Mediterranean that obliges us to look at one shore and neglect the other one, a Mediterranean that considers us as looking out into the sea as a limitless space. But there is another Mediterranean, the one that is given to us by antiquity. If we read it without distorting it, that is not as a gilded past that never existed, but as a real laboratory of stories, of encounters, of human experiences that give back the complexity of living on and around the sea. So this is the Mediterranean that I would like to tell to you about, in the hope that it can also be the Mediterranean that our museums and cultural institutions choose to put at the center of their patrimonial narrative, of their collections narrative, of heritage. Now, the first step is to rid ourselves of an illusion, the idea that the Mediterranean has always been, always there, always the same, and that the ancient Mediterranean is simply an earlier version of what we know about. Well, it's not, and it's a distinction worth stressing because it is rich in consequences for our work with heritage. The Mediterranean of the Greeks and Romans, for example, was both larger and smaller than ours, and a fact that is often surprising, it's not a unitary name that makes it a defining frame. The word Mediterranean, as a geographical adjective designating this basin, this pool in its end, in its entirety, Mediterraneis ripis, appears for the first time only in the first century, Anno Domini, with the Latin writer Solinus. Before then, the unitary perception of this sea coexisted with many names, Mare Nostro, political reality of experience. So before them, when it was Mare Terre Halassa, our sea, because it belonged to us, not because it was owned, but it was Pontus, the Greek name, which has the same semantic root of Pons, Latin bridge. It was a sea that had many stories, destinations, relations, one per every route, one per every people that lived on the other side of the shore. And the onomastic logic is an extraordinary conceptual window into how the ancients perceived the sea, not, or at least not only as a space to be measured and delimited, but as a network of paths leading to somewhere, leading to somewhere. The names of the seas were names of destinations, of relationships. The sea was defined by the people who lived around it and the paths that crossed it. Yes, the paths, yes, as in this image, one of the most beautiful and most evocative metaphor that Greek literature has handed down to us. That of the Hygra Keleuta, the wet paths of Homer's sea. But this nameless sea, however, had a concrete and imposing presence. The iconic image with which we are all familiar, this one, is that of Plato, who is in the Phaedo, has Socrates illustrate this small part of the world that men inhabit, from the river Phasis to the pillars of Heracles, by standing by the shores of the sea like ants or frogs by the shores of a swamp. It is a cosmic summary. It is clear, not a snapshot from Google Earth, but it is also an image of density and indefatigable mobility. Frogs, with their amphibious movement on the shores and in the water, ants with their infinite number, their continuous dynamism along the shores, and the diverse swarming of this life around and within the sea is the very history of Mediterranean civilization. And this is a sea that is a space of communication and communicability. Hesiod, at the conclusion of the Theogony, addresses the world in its orderly arrangement and greets all those who inhabit the islands and continents and the salty sea in the middle, pointing to a tripartition that says it all. The sea is not separation, it is the connecting element between islands and continents, the midpoint between different worlds, between different dreams, with these Hereford map of Herisopondi that is attributed to Richard de Bello. And this suggestion helps to introduce the first of the three characteristics of the Mediterranean heritage that I would like to propose as keys to our journey. The ancient Mediterranean should be read, first of all, as a space of communicability rather than a space of communication. I don't know whether this word exists, but what I mean it is that it is the potential structural openness to communication. This communicability was not abstract, not utopian. It was translated into concrete and historically documented practices right from the epochal voyages of the beginning of the first millennium before Christ. You can see the images as represented here on the big screen, the dipylon and the Greek epos. They were praxes of the first millennium before Christ, enterprises aimed at building relationships, not simply the transport of goods, the exchange of gifts. It's not a network of matrimonial alliances, circulation of men and technical knowledge, of iconographic models or ritual practices. We can show this whole image. This is what we want to recount and narrate. The sea, as Plato's Phaedo indicates, is a great comparator around which the life of human communities organized in multiple forms is arranged. The Mediterranean journey across the sea is experience, is enrichment, is the construction of a self that is defined in the encounter with the different from ours. This does not mean that it was peaceful. Raiding, piracy, war, as represented, are in their own way forms of contact, ways of crossing distance and interacting with otherness in a system where violence is explicitly part, differently from what we do hypocritically, is the pragmatic horizon. Now, the point is clearly not to sustain improbable, ironic visions of the Mediterranean, but to recognize the sea as a space sailed upon, traveled, frequented, experienced as a meeting ground, risky between different communities. And they become more and more similar because they meet. We can call it with an evocative formula that I always am reminded of by this Renaissance Portolano image, is an equatorial glue, a Mediterranean sea, not as a barrier, but as a substance uniting the lands around it, as the medium through which ancient civilizations built themselves in relation to one another. A systemic diversity, organic diversity, as the famous book by Horden and Purcell presented it with their image of Mediterranean connectivity, the corrupted sea, what becomes an interpretative key for a system that needs to integrate in order to survive, that generates exchanges, not despite differences, but precisely through them, through differences. So we should encounter this conceptual reversal. And this is the second point of view I would like to share with you, probably the most important one for us. We are always dealing with heritage. So the second character, so to speak, I would like to propose is the idea of frontier. I'd like to get rid of the great divide, the frontier as a demarcation time line, sorry, as an impassable border. Is a construction of the nation states, emphasized and elevated to a fetish in the history of the 19th and 20th centuries, but it does not correspond to the historical experience of the ancient Mediterranean. Scholars of social and cultural history, on the other hand, use another British term that is worth introducing: frontier, not as it was defined by Friedrich Jackson Turner, the American frontier that dominated the first half of the last century, but instead the Chinese perspective of Owen Lattimore that fascinated antiquists like Moses Finlay and Ettore Lepore. So in this perspective, the frontier is not a line, but an area. It's not a limit, but a field of experience. It does not separate, but brings together. It is the space in which different cultures meet to measure themselves, sometimes clash. We've seen that, of course, but in any case, transform each other. They become closer. It is the space of a mixing, of a hybridization, of change. The ancient Mediterranean, and in particular the Ionian and Adriatic area that directly concerns us since they host us, has historically been a frontier in this sense, not a border between separate worlds, but a space of experiences assimilating diversity, transforming it into something new and especially shared. And this has left its mark even in the landscape, in its perception and denomination. Or, for example, the white rocks that open to the Adriatic Ionic area, the propylae, the uh, rocks that illuminate and which appear shining bright as the manifestation of the fostering welcome to navigators. And this returns in the toponyms of the Mediterranean. But two of these are guardians at the entrance of the Adriatic embrace: Leucade, the small island south of Corfu, but also Corfu with its white rocks, the Apollo Leucaudio sanctuary, and in Apulia, Leuca, the Leucopetra tarantirorum that you can see in these images. And both have this toponym that comes from Greek, leukos, and these two white images that are the specular signal of the same glance, the glance from the sea. And again, I refer to images produced by various researchers that have been studying these aspects for years in Italy and Croatia. And you see the set of concrete language of shared memory that constitute the sacred aspects on the Ionic and Adriatic coasts. Let me remind you of some of these toponyms and places that I personally, and especially thanks to the collaboration and guide of the colleague and friend Rita Auriemma, I recently studied the sanctuary of Leuca in Grotta Porcinara, Castro, where Francesco d'Andria found something shedding light on the Apellinum of Castrum, and also the Roca site, Grotta Poesia, and the Torre dell'Orso nearby. Well, they really represent a system that really is at the mouth of the Adriatic Sea, that is held together, as shown, with a set of sites that is in the depth of the sea, which is really mirroring rituals, shapes, forms that we can recognize, the presence of caves, inscriptions as a ritual language. They really narrate the construction of a common grammar of sacred aspects. And from the point of view of the narration of this sacred aspect, the figure of Diomedes that is really pervasive, but as an amphibian form in its presence, with those strategic places of the area, not as a symbol of the Homeric hero, but as a god that is shared on the Salento coast in the Tremati Pelagosa. That is very important for navigation to the north, that can be seen in Ancona, Pola, Pelagosa, Croatia, Istria, a presence that really is symbolically present in and along the whole coast, and that unifies the diversity of the Adriatic peoples. And so let me go back to the material traces of this construction of time. We can read it, we can really touch it, feel it, and exhibit it in our museums, but especially we should find a code to give it more worth and communicate that. Because this geography, made up of histories and stories, can still talk to us, and still does. And in our macro region of the Adriatic and Ionic regions, with the ancient routes of the sacred places and the toponyms, reveals elements that can only be handed down thanks to preservation, conservation, storytelling, and valorization. That has to be exhibited. So even the most mythical narration, as suggested by the ancient thinkers, can help us to understand the experiential dimension in connecting it to the heroic protagonists, their routes, adventures. You see here the Myrmidons, Odysseus, the god Dionysus, in documents that are very famous, and which allow us to hand down lasting knowledge of places that is built and shared in historical experiences, or storicized by the myth, by the legends, as for example the heroines of the antique Mediterranean. So females that travel and sail the seas exactly like the male ones that embark on travels and that do not return. Here you see Metopus in the Museum of Salinas in Palermo. And by the way, thank you to the museum for using the image. And Herodotus reminds us of that. And if this is the narration, there is another similar phenomenon. I am the girl that sails the sea and separates the two shores of the Ionosporos, of the passage of the self, the ion, that the Greek called the Adriatic Scorpus, the sea that we can see from a close look. She is a mythical figure that sails the sea, and it is something that can really change in time. And these can be our communities. They can narrate their stories. So our museums have the legacy of these functions. They are the guardians of this fabric that is made up of stories, not fake things, but stories. And amongst the many aspects that this heritage has conveyed as a narration, as rituals and practical forms, there are some that we run the risk of losing because the way in which this were conveyed was not written in text nor in author or object, but was narrated by bodies, practices that no longer exist. They are Mediterranean stories that need to be recovered. And amongst these, the knowledge of a sea that has disappeared because of the rapid and huge disruptive technological changes that in the last 150 years have really created a huge chasm between the navigation of the past routes, antique routes, and the present ones. And thanks to archaeology, we can recover the knowledge of the ships, the constructions and building techniques, the size of these ships, but the routes and the knowledge of these ships is something that has been lost. And it really represents a practice, a melee, as the Greek say, the ability of knowing the element, techne for the Greek, and concrete ars, navigandi for the Romans, not a science, not as what is perceived today with our machines and technology of navigation. It was something that was handed down on board in the experience of sailing the seas, a memory that was handed down generation after generation that was interrupted by interrupting this human link, human change. So it's an immaterial heritage in the deep sense of this term, and museum experience can try to recover it, looking for its traces by welding it to the pressing environmental issues that today are very, very important and should set up a new source of global education, a new ecological sensitivity. So this work of recovery, of transmission and handing down implicates a huge potentiality, the possibility of looking for new subjects that are invisible from the past. The women are not handed down, but they are really there. They populated our history. Look at the great mother of the Mediterranean in the Minoic and Mycenaean shapes, the Isis Navision of the Romans, for example. And we've seen it in the legendary one, mythical one, represented by the two myths we talked about, Scylla, the monsters, the mermaids. So the reality is that women were systematically marginalized. But women are present, and in a way, they can really be the subject matter of a new storytelling. But we need to wonder about this. And namely, in the Platonic swamp, we've talked about are women ants or frogs? And if the answer has long been geared toward the former, the ants in a sort of conditioned automatism, now we know that women are both. They are travels without returning. They're desperate routes of movement. So if both are possible, and we know that, the invitation to our museums is to seek out the hidden feminine, to make it visible, and to tell its part in the Mediterranean heritage with the female look and glance. Even the reference, now I'm going to talk about the third aspect I'd like to touch upon, and which is the most valuable and urgent. The heritage of the ancient Mediterranean is a knowledge of long time ago, a knowledge that allows us to look at the phenomena of the present with the eyes of those who know that the sea has seen it all, or almost all. And as you can see in the very, very famous drawing of the crater of the Ischia ship with the doling and suffering uh, shipwreck, is something that we've been aware of in the last 3,000 years. So these are aspects that return and are repeated. They are actually recurrences. Brodel understood this better than almost anyone. His Méditerranée stems from the conviction that only the perspective of a long time ago and understanding it allows us to understand what this context of histories is, because it is an ongoing becoming. And this, his intuition of a basin traversed by liquid plains communicating by means more or less white gates is not far removed from the Homeric humid paths. It is the same idea of a sea that connects, that circulates, that does not separate, of a mobility in the ancient Mediterranean that was not exceptional but structural. It is not the crisis, but it is the norm. Looking at that laboratory does not give us ready-made answers to today's problems, but it does offer something that is far more precious, the ability not to be overwhelmed by the anxiety of the present times, but not to see the apocalypse, but look at the perspective of a long time, a recurrence. So to conclude, which Mediterranean can we talk about as a heritage? Well, this is the answer I propose: a Mediterranean that is a critical mirror of the present, not a nostalgic consolation, a Mediterranean that does not use ancient history to prove that it has always been like that, a trivialization that historical research cannot endorse, but to know and recognize in particular that the phenomena we experience today have deep roots, recurring dynamics, and that their complexity deserves respect and understanding, not anxious simplification. The ancient Mediterranean, a space of communication, the field of a frontier history of experiences that assimilate diversity, the knowledge of the long time of our past that recomposes phenomena and causes, that is not only a beautiful heritage to be preserved and conserved, but a tool for active understanding of the world in which we live. Our cultural institutions, our museums, archaeological sites, historical sites, custodians of the material traces of a Mediterranean history, namely of that history built in interrelation and confrontation, have an inescapable responsibility to read it, propose it, understand it, transmit it, convey it in such a way that this dynamic is comprehensible and placed in fruitful dialogue with the present. The three reading keys that we have followed: the structural communicability, the frontier as a field of experience, not as a line of exclusion, the knowledge of the long past eras that recomposes the observation of phenomena in a rational key, can guide the concrete choices of our museums, our exhibition programs, our cultural cooperation projects, suggesting what to look at, how to observe, and how to connect all this. Because the sea of myths, legend of human beings is a story, is a history that continues to talk to us if we are willing to listen to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The big round of applause is the sign of the great appreciation for this speech, because together we saw so many dimensions with a deep thought, together with these the daily practice of the museums, the fact that we talk about these related complexity, and that we know how to understand that with such a richness of suggestions. Well, this is food for thought, really, for all of us. And this is helping us uh, focusing on the main topics that we decided as a guide for our days. Thank you very much. That's a great beginning. And it's just a beginning. Now let's move on with the next speech. Now let me try and pronounce his name. Neža Čebron Lipovec, almost, well, let's say quite well. I pronounced it quite well. She's a historian of art and architecture at the Department of Archaeology at the Coverlizza University. She will talk about the cultural heritage in a specific key, anthropologic key also. She can work in these cross-border dimension, and this is why we would like her to tell us about the narrative of the heritage in this dimension that we have from the cross-border point of view. Thank you very much. I will use my end, so why not? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? No? Can you hear me now? No. Thank you very much. Very good. The speaker is speaking in her native language, Slovenian. Dear colleagues, don't worry, don't worry. It was just an introduction, just a taste of my mother tongue, Slovenian, which is one of the official languages of Italy in a small part of Friuli Venezia Giulia that we'll mention among other topics today. It is a great honor to be here and a great pleasure to be here with you today, sharing our Slovenian experiences on the research and interpretation of multivocal narratives on the heritage of our territory, the Adriatic territory. And in my presentation, I will focus on the interpretation and conservation, focusing on the border territory and focusing on the best practices that we have in Nova Gorica and Gorica, two cities at the frontier with the Italian territory. Now, let's start with a couple of ideas. First of all, we should sum up what the heritage is. It is not just something in itself. It is a process instead of meaning making through communication and experience. So first of all, this is what this is all about. It is a social process of evaluation. And this also includes some other inputs, as we know from several papers. Consequently, the interpretation of the heritage, as the WIPI colleagues suggest, is the process of meaning, as I was saying, or meaning making, specifically through communication and experience. Therefore, preservation is not just about managing some data as we thought in the past. It is instead a process of management of creative continuity and heritage practices aimed at social cohesion, as suggested by Yoki Lento and Chitti. So it's not just a change management. This is why participation and collaborative research are at the center of both activities. And this becomes a real interpretation in itself. So what about these objectives in the frontier spaces, rich in conflicts, but also in some other shared elements? How can we approach the border spaces steeped in dissonant multivocality? And this is what we know from several papers, such as the paper, The Invention of Everyday Life, that we know from Michel Desertot. So we deal with the identity of the person and the individual and the communities the frontier lived and interpreted in the reality, into the reality. And this is mainly about the border territory, the area that in Slovenian is called Primorska, that means littoral, along the Sota River to Istria. It is a multicultural territory with so many people coming from Slovenia, from the Friuli-Venezia region, also Croatians are there, and there are also some other communities such as Bosnian, Serbian, Macedonian communities. And today we also have excellent examples of sustainable cross-border tourism. However, it is a territory with so many mobile frontiers. It is a troubled border territory, especially in the 20th century. First of all, we had of course, the First World War, and then the front. And then we also had fascism, where we had a sort of annihilation of the Slovenian population. And finally, we also had inhuman violence. Then, with the Second World War, let's remember that in Trieste, we had the Risera di San Saba, as we know, the Nazi fascist extermination camp, where we had so many violences after the war, so post-war violences and vendettas, with so many consequences, such as a deliberate emigration. Then in the second post-war, we identify the border between Slovenia and Italy. And then we know what happened with the Iron Curtain that was drawn. Then this was technically disappeared thanks to the origin of the European Union. The Iron Curtain seemed to be a wall. However, this wall was punctured by various tactics, such as the possibility for residents to obtain a pass, a document that allowed them to cross the border for easing and facilitating their daily life. What about the current narratives of the frontier? Let's take a look at them through a real best practice coming from the city of Nova Gorica, that together with ancient Gorica, won the title of European Capital of Culture in 2025, thanks to the program on the frontiers of the two cities. Nova Gorica is a city that was built ex novo, and its building was done after the Treaty of Paris of 1947, when the unique territory was divided in two, separating the multicultural city of Gorica from the karst hinterland. Then we had what we now know as Nova Gorica, the new Gorica at the frontier. Therefore, design on some new and modern models of functionalism coming from Le Corbusier, the city is representing a multidimensional national heritage. It was thus the European capital of 2025 with its 1,600 events and 1 million visitors. Of course, its best results is the EPIC, the European Platform for the Interpretation of the 20th Century, placed in the previous warehouse or deposit for goods. And its main author is Kaya Shiro, that you know very well because she's a member of International ICAM. The exhibition is known to be a deposit or repository of memories through which these two stories, the two cities, tell their stories. And the pattern of the exhibition offers the possibility of a visit and a parallel lecture of the official narratives, such as what we know from the Italian books of history as for example, what we know as the Caporetto defeat of 1917 in Slovenian ones is the Battle of Caporetto. So we know that we have these differences depending on the book of history that we consider. In this field, we know the daily narratives revealing some complex and intimate relationships, supportive relationships, mixed marriages, and families divided between two borders. And from these stories, we know about the installation of the frontier, but we also know something about the tactics during the Yugoslav era. And then we have Gorica as the window for the Western fashion of Slovenians. The exhibition was created and continues to be used in a participant way. And in the latest area of the exhibition, we have objects, also testimonies brought by visitors. We know what happened in both sides of the frontier in the cross-border territory. Therefore, in the two cities, building a multi-year work of various associations working in this area. A huge contribution, thanks to the help of Kaya Shiro, was given through the Association for 7-4, giving inputs and research on the cross-border oral history through some guided tours and memory walks that are essential for giving a transgenerational impact as well as a long-term impact from the topography of memory point of view. Now, let's take a look at another city, also running for the Capital of Culture 2025. So we know copper and Istra linked to the northern border and the various cities of Croatia, Istria, and Rijeka. We know that the territory, of course, has been implemented during the years. We know what the identity is of this little city after of course, the Venetian rule that marked the area. In the region of Istria, we know that the situation has changed so much in the last 100 years. For example, we had the creation of the multilingual temporary state. And then we also know what happened from the point of view of the Free Territory of Trieste between 1947 and 54. History is mirroring these troubled period, also marked from the violence of the fascism and, of course, the violence of the Second World War. We know what happened next, the exodus that influenced the events. The emigration of populations from urban centers was occurred from 1943 to 56 and involved an almost complete change in the demographic structure of the urban center. Only 8% of people remain there, composing today the Italian minority. At the same time, we also had the beginning of a strong migration flow that began from the Istrian hinterland to the other areas surrounding. Today, the Slovenian Istria area is a bilingual territory, Slovenian and Italian, and is a very multicultural territory. After the industrial development from the post-war, today the region is mainly focused on an economy based on tourism and also mass tourism, unfortunately, with a strong impact on the narratives of the heritage, where we have the romantic narrative, but also narrative on the Venetian feature of the region, as well as the accent on the more Istrianity, as we may call it, of the territory. So the development of tourism was born in the second post-war, when we had the first regulatory plan in the new region of the Slovenian coast. In the same process, we also had the conception of a new architectural language that changed visibly the face of the historic city, taking an expression that was much more a traditional expression, with the will to have a new architecture, a progressive and Mediterranean architecture that architect Michelet was referring to. And we know from his words that architecture doesn't know any political nor ethnical differences. However, with this new architecture and this new environment, we had the collective memories of the new collectivity, the new urban multicultural community, a community that, in the words of Vlado Shaw, in the 90s, had just half of a century of life and common history. Since 2000, many buildings were demolished, and these, of course, created some thoughts. What are the values that the community is giving to history? Is it possible that this is the consequence of a feeling of non-belonging to the area, or maybe a feeling of lack of power? in the post-socialist transition. If we give a voice to the inhabitants, how would they evaluate these historical spaces? In 2012, after these inputs, we had a new collaboration. The title of this collaboration was I Tell the Story of the City, Racconto la storia della città, with the confrontation and a relationship on the memories that we had. We had seven events, sorry, from the year 2014. Each of these events was focused on a specific historical setting of activity. We had the very first event on the ancient Servite convent, which served as a civic hospital since the 19th century. So waiting for the renovation of the building, we were waiting for an approach that was a participated approach. And then it became a common maternity word and therefore a birthplace area. But especially this became the main area for exchanging knowledge about the building's ancient history. And this hospital, that was the maternity word, was welcoming people coming from the whole region. The events linked to the collaboration research were also included in the regional museum of copper, where we also had a participated exhibition where mothers and also midwives contributed with pictures, objects, and written memories. The crucial element was the so-called Libro dei Ricordi, the Book of Memories, where all the people involved were writing their own memories, written memories on spaces and people. In 2024, we had a new initiative after that with a twin book of memories in a digital version, completely bilingual. In a period of 2 months, we had more than 600 entries, and all the material was collected and will be presented in the area of the renovated convent, where a central hall will be set up as an interpretation center. However, we have to say that we also had conflicts between narratives that were born after the Second World War. So conflicts between generations, but also conflicts between between ethnic national narratives. However, we also wanted to highlight the constructive and positive side of this initiative, where we had sharing, meetings, and also we had what we know to be the only place where we had people coming from Ljubljana, Trieste, agents, soldiers, where social events were done in order to eliminate the barriers, especially the linguistic barriers. This specific building was conceived as an elementary school, a monumental school, designed under the lead of the Ministry for Education in Rome. For the area, it was like the main center of redemption. The building was never concluded because of course, the beginning of the war. And the main function was an exclusive function. There was a meeting point. The process that during the events was done through participants was then identified as memory talk. That is a central concept in environmental psychology. And this is something dealing with social memories rooted in places, both present and vanished, and people, both living and deceased, outside of intentionally commemorative and ritual contexts, revealing a deeply meaningful way of relating to the surrounding world, both physical and social, as in the words of Daniel in 2005. The group memory talk was a participatory research method of historical environments with a comparison of various individual memories as well as collective memories around the creation of a sense of community, but also the collaborative identification of elements and historic spaces with a huge historic and social value to be integrated in the promotion of the recovery process. One of the main case studies was on another open space in the same area without an official name, known as the Giardinetto, the small garden in the heart of Copper's whole town, an open space currently without an efficient toponym, but several historical toponyms. It was then eliminated at the beginning of the 70s for creating some parking lots in the area. Then this launched a participated research exposing a series of narratives on the historical value of the area, and also dealing with some other stories and narratives focusing on the main social and historic value of this area, of this green area. Of course, we will identify the multiculturalism and multi dialects that we had in the region. We had so many more memories coming from these areas, such as the hand-drawn plan of the historic park, where we had the participation also of the some older participants, thus contributing to the understanding of the site and the space of the site. In terms of narratives, however, we had a central moment of transgenerational sharing when the public was involved and when a participant from the audience spoke about what seemed to be lost in the past. So this testimony was focusing the so-called bridging social capital, that is the effect of the feeling to be connected with several communities in the same place. Therefore, this area changed from an almost unknown place to a place with so many people, a sort of an intimate place. Then we also had, after this, the recovery project on part of the garden, and this, of course, will have the same name that we had in the past, the Giardinetto name. Then we also had some parallel and shared narratives with some group memory works so that we can really give a vocal and a multivocal evaluation of the space. Therefore, we have a various approach with several communities, with so many roots in the Istrian area, especially in the domain of the Forum Tonizza Cultural Festival, relating Trieste and Koper and Umago in Croatia. A tribute to the writer Fulvio Tomizza, born in Umag and then emigrated to Trieste. However, we also have some other silent narratives, as we may call them, that are focusing on the fundamental anthropological research on the so-called left behind. We had so many works in recent years, such as the work of anthropologist Katia Obrat-Brilloger, that has given a voice to the collective memory of Istrian Italians, rarely emphasized. At the center of the story or storytelling, as we may call it, we have the historical trauma passed down through generations. That is about the generations of those who are forgotten and expelled, erased from Slovenian national narratives because they were Italian. So with this idea of presenting these parallel narratives in the Museum of Capodistria, so the Museum of Copper, we have the exhibition named The Heart of Istria, where we have the interpretation of the territory in its complexity, exposing some various and dissonant narratives with two main narratives, a document from 1922 testifying the Italianization, the so-called forced Italianization of the Slavic population, and another from the year 1943, testifying the encouraged emigration. Then we also have a further step forward of what we do from a transgenerational and cross-border point of view. The idea comes from some previous experiences presented before in order to have a dialogue between people coming from different generations and different cultures. In the picture, we have an Italian poet, an elderly Italian poet coming from Istria, telling her perception of the city to her mother and daughter who live in Trieste, coming from a family of Slovenian immigrants after the war. So the narratives that seems to be different from the ethnic point of view actually emerged as the narratives linked to the same belonging, where the main connection was traumas of the families involved. And at the same time, we wanted to be connected with the territory from a historical point of view and also with the present. Let's conclude by giving some thoughts on the role of the museum and the potential of the museum. Let's focus on the works of art removed from churches and museums in 1940 and that brought to Friuli and then Rome as a preventive measure at the outbreak of the war. The debate that was politically changed was around two principles, that is the territorial belonging of the works of art and then the cultural belonging, identifying the works of art in the Museum of Trieste, the Sartorio Museum. The conflict, however, is not considering those Italians who still live in Istria and pray in front of in the churches and in front of empty altars. Then we have some questions. So is this something that we should follow? For example, we had some examples coming from other museums where after giving back the object to the original community, the museum is keeping an empty display case with an accompanying explanation of the need and the concept to give back an object to life. Today, we have the original museum of the city of Copper, which was once the Civic Museum, waiting for some new works of art. The institutions of course, should work as a bridge and as a space for dialogue, interpreting also the disagreement that we still have, giving voice to the various voices. From the point of view of Trieste, we have the complex context that provoked of course, the relocation of the works, and also from the point of view of the institutions of copper, we are exposing and interpreting the empty walls. Now, let's conclude by focusing on the concept of bridge museum, a museum as a place of sharing and co-creation. A museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage, communicating in an ethical and professional way with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. End of the quotation. These tenancies in heritage may really be a space considered as a space for dialogue and mutual recognition, as we know from the words of Kisic in 2016. So, can this be a dialogue to be opened within museums mutually in the cross-border context? Sorry. Thank you very much for your attention.
This big hand really shows how appreciated the presentation was. It really allowed us to understand how boundaries can become frontiers, as the previous speaker explained. So we really have to be able to understand all of these signs and make them be understood by all museums. So let me invite on our stage the last speaker of our morning. And again, we are enlarging and increasing the scope of our outlook. And we are going to invite from his experience in San Benedetto del Tronto here in Italy, but as a very close relationship with the other shore of the Adriatic. We have Giuseppe Merlini, who will speak of the alliances and museum networks in the Mediterranean. Well, thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you, Mrs. Pina, ICOM president, and all of the people who, with her, supported the organization of this convention, since I believe it was not that easy to manage all of the aspects required by these 2 days of conference. So as the Mediterranean Maritime Museums Association, I'm really very, very happy to be here. So the AMMM acronym in Italy. So the president couldn't be here today, but I will represent her. I am very happy to be here because we celebrate the 10th birthday of becoming ICOM members when in 2016 we attended the Milan International Conference and became ICOM members. So after these 10 years, I can say that the maritime museums should be acknowledged as a specific aspect of being an ICOM partner. So I was asked to speak about the representation and narration of the Mediterranean for us, of the Maritime Museum Association. I hope I will be up to the task because my presentation is quite technical as the Capo representative. So let me explain what the Association of Mediterranean Maritime Museums is. What is it? AMMM. Well, It is an association that brings together different maritime museums, heritage management institutions, both tangible and material and immaterial, and cultural bodies working in the field of maritime heritage in the Mediterranean basin to be able to preserve, conserve it, disseminate, and give worth to it. This is our goal. The association was born in Dubrovnik. It was founded on October 14th, 1998, but in reality, it had a long history in its back. It took a lot of time to be founded. It was desired by the president of the Barcelona Maritime Museum in 1994 because the president had acknowledged the year before by hosting a conference on maritime museums that there was this lack and the need of grouping under one signage, under one big family, this typology of museums, and not only this typology. Why do I say that? Well, because there are two main types of partners and associations belonging to the AMMM. Oh, okay. I hadn't moved on the slides. So we have two categories of partners, the museum institutions, which are full members. Then we have the affiliate members, associations or single lovers, individuals who want to preserve the haven or port of the Mediterranean. So this is a geography that can give you an outlook of the wide-ranging relationship and network of the consortium of AMMM. So 62 participants coming from 13 different countries. Italy has 19 institutions represented in the AMMM and belonging to it. Then we have Spain, one museum in the south, and the others are all on the Catalan part. Croatia, 11 institutions. And then Europe. Well, why? Because it's a part of the AMMM, the European Maritime Heritage is part of it, which is a non-governmental organization in Amsterdam, Northern Europe. But why are they belonging and part of AMMM? Well, because they represent all the private owners of traditional boats, as well as other maritime museums that acknowledge their heritage amongst the interested entities of maritime museums. But what are the types of museums in our associations? Well, there are different ones. We have art museums, ethnographic museums, but also archaeological museums and natural history museums. So if we were to recap the strengths of AMMM, we could state that this heterogeneity allows the association to be in constant dialogue and foster the exchange of experiences amongst these different realities and on different topics. And I will give you some examples of what we do together. Amongst the weaknesses, I was talking to the president and explaining her that the northern part of the African coast is not represented beyond the Maritime Museum of Algiers. We do not have any other representative of the North African coast of the Mediterranean. So here I have the work group that is explained in this roster, so to speak, the executive committee, sorry, all of the names. So who are we? Well, we are a network of large museums of state, regional, and smaller museums, like, for example, province local museums. And what do we do together? Well, we exchange good best practices, experiences, projects, so as to give worth and value to the local expertise. So we collaborate together by meeting annually. So we really hold meetings. These were the places where we held them, where there were the fora that we organize annually. The latest one was hosted by two Catalan museums, Sant Feliu here and Guixol Le Scala. And we spoke about sustainability, museums and sustainability. The next forum will be held in Cana, Greece, in the island of Crete, and we will tackle the future challenges, future prospects, the power of networking. These are the issues we're going to tackle, and I do seize the opportunity of inviting all those who are present here in the audience to participate to the next forum. So now, what did we do in terms of fostering maritime heritage? Well, we gave a vessel cataloging importance. All the partners participated to this enormous teamwork. It was called Malabarka, which means small boat in Croatian. And then we continued to work on that with a new project called Adriatic Art, a result of Malabarka. And it was a great collaboration between Italy, Croatia, and Slovenia. And in fact, I was invited to give you the story of these projects on the Adriatic and Ionic coast, even if other projects were launched on the other coasts of the Mediterranean. Recently, we launched the initiative to include lateen sailing and lug sails that were used in the Mediterranean ports. And we want to be included in the UNESCO list of intangible World Heritage projects. Then other projects we have in mind, Women and the Sea, so as to research how, the female aspect, the mothers, the women were important in disseminating the wealth of the Mediterranean ports. And another work group focused on the sustainability of maritime museums, because of course we want to protect the landscape, but we should also consider the importance of recovering the territories and protecting it. Then another work group focused on museum and health, but the work of the museum should also research the actions and critical aspects of the anthropic presence in these areas. So our main objective is to promote, foster and safeguard the Mediterranean identity. This is our main initiative. Now, going back to the topical subject matter of our conference, narration, and I focused on this story, Tabule et Fabole, by Anselmi, Sergio Anselmi, a great scholar of the Adriatic coast, teaches economic history at the University of Ancona. And Tabule and Fabule was published in the year 2000. So after 26 years, we continue to study it. And he states that no documents are ever written to hand down storytelling. So I reflected on this, and he was right. There was no document researching beyond what a document should state the approach that stands out once you read the document itself. And so I focused on this sort of subjectivism that we all have when we read documents. Documents are our sources. So this is something that also is linked to the concept of working as a museum. How do we approach the visit of a museum? And how does a museum narrate collectively and individually its story to every user? And namely, how much, to what extent do the antique narrations integrate the story that can be considered extremely valid and worth for new generations. So we thought of proposing a set of realities of the Adriatic Sea that have a common roots of belonging. I would start from the Museum of the Batana in Robini. And the House of Batana is an eco-museum. The community really revolves around this small room or space that has become the symbol of the Rovigna community. Then other environments and spaces were created, an Matica shop and a small square, namely the production and restoration of these small boats. Another important reality I would like to shed light upon is the Moscenica Draga Eco Museum. I apologize with my Croatian friends because I never get the right pronunciation. I should call it the Historical Museum of the Croatian Littoral Rijeka. So it is a cooperation with associations and communities for the defense of maritime heritage, regattas, festivals, exhibitions, lectures, workshops, so oral history and material history and objects. Now I would like to speak of Zara, the Bettina Museum of Traditional Shipbuilding. We were there a couple of years ago, and it was a great surprise to see how the Bettina community is involved in restoring and handing down the knowledge and skills of the fishermen and of the Calafata, the master's shipwrights. Then another museum I'm very well aware of, the Cesenatico Maritime Museum. Thanks to Cesenatico, San Benedetto del Tronto was aware of the work of the AMMM. There is this beautiful floating section along the port canal designed by Leonardo da Vinci. And this museum, in recovering traditional boats, was our main professor in a way, because it taught us how to cooperate and recover these old boats owned by fishermen and maybe enterprises, merchants. The Cesenatico Maritime Museum staff participated to the Sette festival, and the way in which sails are dyed, the nets are repaired, in front of 600,000 attendees. This is how important the Set festival was, and Cesenatico was a very a fundamental part of its success. Now to close, San Benedetto del Tronto, a small museum pole or hub. Three out of the six museums were really set up by the San Benedetto fishermen. So the first ethical museum, 1956, exhibits the fish that were told about the San Benedetto fishermen. Then we have the Ampere museums, those that had never been exhibited because of underwater recovery, but these were the objects that the fishermen found in their nets. These amphora go back to the Canaan Punic era and were donated to a physician back then that donated them to the Maritime Bank. So the exhibits are really very, very important. It's an ethnographic museum. And just to show you the importance of recovering the memory of the community, what did we do? Well, last year, with the support of the historical archive of the municipality and the Sea Museum, we organized Il Bacio del Mare, an exhibit, the Kiss of the Sea, that was like a sort of a backdrop to interview the old experts and professions of maritime civilization. And we projected and animated the IDs of the people who 100 years ago worked in these ports and sailed these seas, the men and the women who were really key for all this. So let me close by inviting you to attend our meeting next year in Crete. Thank you. Thank you very much for introducing this important reality, the many the organization of initiatives that you have organized, the many meetings that you have organized.